So thank you everyone for joining us for this next session. Thank you everyone for joining us for this next panel. We are excited to have our speakers join us today. This panel is on Indigenous health and climate change. Okay, I don't know what the jingle is, Lisa, that you use. 1, 2, 3, all eyes on me, I think. So we can get started. So welcome to our panel discussion on Indigenous health and climate change, where we will delve into the profound intersectionality between Indigenous communities and the global climate crisis. I'm Dr. Shaneeta Johnson. I am the Fellowship Director for our Chef and Peach Fellowships here at the Consortium, and I am excited to have our esteemed guests with us this morning. Indigenous peoples, stewards of some of the world's most biodiverse regions, have long held crucial knowledge and perspectives on environmental sustainability and resilience. However, they also face disproportionate impacts from climate change, threatening not only their traditional ways of life, but also the rich cultural heritage embedded within their communities. Our esteemed panelists will explore these complex dynamics, shedding light on the urgent need for inclusive, collaborative solutions that honor Indigenous wisdom and rights in the face of environmental crisis. Our first speaker is Amba-Rose Atkinson. Amba is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Medicine in the University of Queensland. Her research explores the health impacts of Indigenous cultural practices, like cultural burning, on country and people, emphasizing the vital role of Indigenous knowledge in addressing environmental, climate, and health challenges. Welcome, Amba.
I'm just going to quickly put a timer on myself. Okay. Okay. Just checking this. Yeah, this is working. Okay, great. So, Ginige Nyara, Naja Junagu Junga Nyarangara, to the custodians of the lands that we're currently meeting on, and I'd like to thank the aunties for their welcome, for their beautiful welcome yesterday. Yari, Gala, Nyarangara, Gilagong, Guyu, Duru, Dai, Bin Jalambanya, Giligu. Naim Amba-Rose, Nam Gumbaynggirr Nyami. I'm from the Gumbaynggirr peoples of the mid-north coast of New South Wales in Australia. I'm excited to be here today and to be presenting on Indigenous health and climate change, along with my colleague Victor as well. I'll be speaking a bit about, it'll be sort of localized in an Australian context, but I'll be drawing some parallels to sort of global Indigenous health as well. And I'll be talking about my research. So it's really important for me as an Indigenous person to place space myself and to honor those who I come from, because it is through my family and through my connections to my lands that make me who I am. And I'm proud to be that. I'm proud to be of, Gumbaynggirr Dangari country. I come from a line of beautiful people. This is a photo of my mother when she was taking me to a protest about living with less waste as a baby. This is my grandfather. He really enjoyed camping and fishing and being able to access his traditional lands and be able to practice his cultural practices, which for a long time in Australia and like many Indigenous communities have experienced, we were denied being able to do that. This is a photo of my great-great-grandmother, who was my great-grandmother. She was a fluent speaker of Gumbaynggirr and Dangari. The government policies at the time meant that she was not able to practice her language nor pass that on for fear of having her children removed or even, further penalization from local police forces. So it's really important for me to keep practicing my language I'm learning because that is resistance. And when I'm talking about Indigenous health and climate change, fundamental to these conversations, to these dialogues, has to be Indigenous human and land rights, because an Indigenous worldview, and in a worldview for everybody, that's fundamentally what it comes back to. This is my babaga, my father's family. Again, we really experienced the brunt of government policies that displaced us from our lands, moved us onto missions, and controlled everything that we did, what we could eat, where we could work, who we could marry. And this was all a part of assimilist policies, but that came off the back of massacres and genocides. And when I say, when I talk about colonialism, I'm not talking about it in past tense. It's an ongoing act that is still being committed to this very day to Indigenous peoples and other peoples elsewhere around the world. This is a photo of my father and my great-grandmother and my great-grandmother. So I'm going to play a video if I can figure out how to press. Okay. Wow. This screen or this screen? Oh. No, it's not working. Oh, it's not actual touchscreen. So just quickly. Sorry, I'm just going to play a video just to kind of provide a bit of contextual background in Australia for about 2 minutes.
The story of our communities, people and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were and where we belonged. We took care of each other, our land and our waters. We ate food that made us healthy, lived on country and abided by our laws and song lines. Our families, our children were happy, with strong minds and hearts, because they were where they belonged. But then everything changed.
Colonization came, bringing wars, disease, famine, violence, and the destruction and violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities.
We were denied our knowledge, language, ceremonies, and identity, the very things that tell us who we are and where we belong, and our connections with each other and the land grew weak.
And then our children were taken from us. They had their names changed and their identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them.
For years this happened, and those children became known as the stolen generations.
Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds, leaving scars that are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively.
So across the board, Indigenous peoples experience disproportionate health outcomes in comparison to non-Indigenous populations, both in Australia and in global Indigenous contexts. This is evident in that our burden of disease is 2.3 times that of non-Indigenous Australians. It's reflected in our life expectancy, suicide rates, even incarceration rates, and prevalence of chronic diseases. Last year, a coronial inquiry into a cluster of rheumatic heart disease deaths of 3 young Aboriginal women in a remote community of Doomadgee in Queensland concluded that privilege, institutional racism, lack of cultural competency, and poor communication contributed to the substandard healthcare and these avoidable deaths. Another example is trachoma, which was eradicated in mainstream Australia over 100 years ago. Yet Australia remains the only high-income country where trachoma is endemic, and it is only found in Indigenous communities. So for context, this is a map of Australia. It's a map of so-called Australia. What it shows is all of the diverse nations that make up the continent where I come from. So we have over 250 different nations, each with their own laws, languages, ceremonies, and within that, there's over 800 dialects. We make up 3.8% of the population, and our elders of that make up 5.4%, and our median age is 24. So also above is the Torres Strait Islands. If you hear when I say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, it's talking about the group of small islands just to the north of Cape York at the top east. So central to our culture is the holistic nature of health and well-being. Good health is dependent on respectful and reciprocal relationships to country, culture, community, spirituality, and family. We have a Gidawagam Yarangegu Wadja responsibility to look after country, and it's our cultural and human right to exercise this. So I put in these statistics just because it shows the makeup of our population and really places emphasis on protecting our elders and honoring our elders, because our life expectancy pre-colonization was in many cases over 100 years, and colonization has decimated that, and where we are years behind, as you saw on the previous slide. They hold our stories of our land, they hold our languages, they hold our ways of being, thinking, and doing. And it is important that we look out for our elders and our old people so that we can carry on our culture, which is so central to the health of our land and the health of our communities. So I want to draw attention just quickly to what is known as the Indigenous estate, which is where, this is all Aboriginal land. It has been, we live in a colonial state in a settler colonial context. But interestingly, 57% of Australia's landmass is owned by Indigenous peoples through white man's law. And thinking about our global Indigenous communities, where again, we make up a small percent, 6.2% of the global population. While we represent such small numbers, we are representing in our languages, in our health outcomes, we make up larger proportions of that. So for example, while we're only 6.2%, our Indigenous languages consist of 57% of the world's total languages spoken. Now, why I want to draw attention to these is that language is so important. It holds the key, it holds the code to looking after and caring for country. And so if our languages go, so too do those knowledge bases. In an Indigenous worldview, everything is connected. Health is not separate. Law is not separate. Our family structures are not separate. Our plants, our animals, our rocks, our soil are not separate. We are one, and we are intimately connected. And the whole basis of our life and philosophy is structured upon that. So the global Indigenous estate represents 32% of the total area of land in the world, comprising of 43 million square kilometers. And 81% of those lands are in moderate to good ecological condition, accounting for 39% of the Earth's most ecologically intact lands. So critically, Indigenous peoples protect and steward 80 to 90% within that of the Earth's remaining biodiversity. So we are essential. We are the past, we are the present, and we are the future. And what that looks like in terms of disrupting current power imbalances is a longer story, which I probably won't get to within my next 10 minutes, but certainly opens the conversation up for broader dialogue about that. So we know that deforestation, biodiversity loss, and carbon emissions are lower on land governed by Indigenous peoples. For example, deforestation rates in the territories managed by mob in the Amazon tend to be 50% lower than that in territories elsewhere. And almost half of the intact forests in the Amazon, they only generate 2.6% of the region's carbon emissions. So this is a photo of my great-great-grandmother and great-great-uncle, and a photo of a koala that experienced devastation through the 2019-2020 bushfires. So thinking about these images, what do we know? Colonization is bad for your health. Climate change is a symptom of that and is also bad for your health. So during these fires, Australia land masses larger than Belgium, Denmark, and the Netherlands burned. And that's scorched country. There were 33 fatalities, over 1 billion animals died, and 430 tons of carbon dioxide were emitted into the atmosphere from that. What I see when I look at these photos is the impact of colonization on my people, on my culture, on our country and our kin. And it just breaks my heart. And there's so much work that we have to do in championing and advocating for Indigenous peoples so that we don't continue to see this devastation, because, you know, so many people were in an uproar about the koalas because, you know, they're adorable. But when I see that, when we look at that, that is exactly as if it was the death of a human, that our lives are not more important than our plants and our animals and our rocks. They're equal to. So this is a diagram of a paper that was published last year with my supervisors and other colleagues working in the space. It really sort of highlights the climate change impacts on First Nations health. Again, this impacts everybody, but disproportionately, we know that it impacts Indigenous peoples more so. It's not just health, it's the loss of our cultural landscapes that is also really impactful. So I'll leave that up there there's the references afterwards. So in response to all of this, because I was extremely impacted by those fires, as a lot of people were, I started my research project, which is about looking at the relationship between the health of the land and the health of my people, and how this relationship and how the knowledge is underpinning this relationship can and must be embedded in environmental, climate, and health solutions. So the purpose of my study is to reposition country as health. It's not just merely the absence of a disease or illness. It is, I see culture as health, as being intimately connected. And so when I talk about health, I'm also talking about culture. It's building an evidence base for my countries and my communities and advocating for First Nations knowledges. So I'm doing it on my mother's lands in the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and doing it on my father's lands, southeast Queensland. And these are the communities that I'm working with. My research participants are knowledge holders, rangers. So rangers, their job is to work on country and to look after country. But knowledge holders are just, you know, community members who might not be a ranger, but they hold a lot of knowledge about our culture and community. And also elders, because I think it's really important to protect and honor our old people. So this is just really quickly, because this makes me happy in thinking about all of this, but this is a bunya nut. It is a bunya nut from a tree species that is 200 million years old. It predates dinosaurs, and it is still around. And it is a really important and sacred part of Aboriginal people's lives in my father's communities, but also the songline stretches hundreds of kilometers as well. And these trees are so important for us because a lot of our societies are actually built off of the societies of trees. We look to nature to understand how we can create our societies that mirror nature in a way that is interconnected and not separate. So whenever I see this photo, it makes me happy because it makes me think of the bunya trees and the strength and power that they have as these ancient species that are still here, and that it is our job as custodians of today to keep ensuring that they have a habitat and a future, just as we want as well. So I broke it up. It's huge. I know it's a big topic. That's what everyone says. But I broke it up into three kind of processes: conceptual framework, what is the relationship, measurement approach, how do we measure and define this, and then, what are the policy implications for this? So this is something that I've been working on for the past few months, which is understanding, it's such a huge relationship, it's such a huge philosophy, and such a huge way of living that I really wanted to do justice. So when I was speaking with my research participants, they shared stories and they shared knowledge about how we are and how we be. And what I realized when my participants were speaking is that not only were they talking about the fundamentals of our societies, but they were also speaking to the different ways of relating. And, we often say in Mob, like, Indigenous ways of thinking, being, and doing. And then I just realized that that is exactly what they were doing, of course, in their responses. And I was able to kind of understand, if these relationships, which are happening all the time without us being conscious or not, so country to country, people to country, country to people, people to people, they're happening all the time. And it's whether or not we're tapped into that knowledge of connecting that we can understand how we can protect it, because we cannot center human health in the climate crises. If we do so, that is a missed opportunity. And frankly, that is a failure of appropriate and adequate responses. We have to center the health of the land. Everything comes from the land. And so in thinking about solutions, we need to be understanding all of these different relationships to adequately respond. Because, I see the climate change as a severance of that. And that is really how a lot of Western colonial imperialist systems are structured on: severance and disconnect and exploitation. So my participants talked about different principles, which is that relationship to country, looking after country, ancestors and old people, and passing on knowledge. And if we're doing that in our responses to challenges, then we know that we're doing it in the right way. Some main practices that came out just simply by the makeup of my research participants was fire and language, because a lot of the ranges, we would go out and we would burn country. And so we talked a lot about fire, but it's certainly not reflective of the main practices across all of Queensland. And the indicators of that are infinite, but it's important to read and observe country in order to understand that. And then I believe that all of this has implications for environmental, climate, and health paradigms, and shifting that to truly make transformative change, not just using Indigenous solutions or knowledges as a Band-Aid fix to problems that we did not create. So this is, again, another favorite photo of mine because it speaks to this relationship. Just quickly, I think I have 5 minutes left. So this is a photo of the Bunya Mountains, where the 200 million old trees exist. And rainforests are very biodiverse. But actually, what are more biodiverse than rainforests is grasslands, and speaks to the importance of protecting our grasslands. So these bold patches here that you can see were created through cultural burning, through right fire. And so when I say, I remember quite a number of years ago when I was younger and a bit more angry about the state of the world, which I still am, but just in a different way. I was like, if everybody just, just disappeared, country, nature, the environment, Mother Earth would be fine. And it was through speaking with my elders and aunties and uncles and my communities that, I began to kind of shift my mindset into realizing that country needs people just as much as we need it. And so that really speaks to our role as custodians and as stewards. And so these bold patches that you can see here were injected through fire. And through that Indigenous cultural practice, life was created. Life is generated and sustained and protected. So there's a various number of species that rely solely on that as their habitat. And so if we aren't able to practice our cultural ways, then all of those species will no longer exist. So this is not complete. This is, I'm working on this. This is the sort of policy application, but what I'm trying to show, which again, I want to fix this slide up, but basically, so let's just have a look at some climate crises. So we'll say bushfire, extreme heat, and food insecurity. The impact on people is what a lot of the rhetoric focuses on, because we are people and we are loud and we talk, and we just sort of center ourselves a lot. So let's just say asthma. We know that it increases cases, that it worsens people who already have asthma. Extreme heat, we know that it worsens cardiovascular failure and food insecurity, diabetes. And again, these are all health outcomes that disproportionately impact my people and many Indigenous peoples. So the impact on country, I wrote scorched country, which is a very light way of putting it, mostly because I couldn't fit everything into this work in progress slide, but it's those things that I talked about, the 430 tons of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere. It's the billion animals that lost their lives during the 2019-2020 bushfires. Dry diminished waterways as it are a impact of extreme heat, and food insecurity propels an unbalanced ecosystem. So when thinking about solutions, culture, Indigenous people, like we are the solutions. And again, there's a much broader conversation, which I don't have time to go through in 4 minutes, about how to appropriately apply that. Again, we're not a Band-Aid. But cultural burning in response to bushfires, the environmental, climate and health impact, just the direct one, is reduced air pollution. And then the broader impacts of that are reduced emission, increased carbon sequestration, and increased biodiversity, because cultural burning protects and generates life. It does not take it. When we think about extreme heat, and I loved when Garib was talking yesterday about extreme heat and trees, country has identity. It is not simply a landscape. It has personality, it has character, and we as Indigenous people understand what that looks like and also what it should look like. So if we restore the identity of country, for example, planting the right trees, we increase shade and cooling, and then broader impacts, increase carbon sequestration, increase biodiversity, etc. Thinking about food insecurity, if we can restore and reshape food economies, in Australia, the agricultural industries produce a lot of emissions, and it's also done through animals that are not right for the environment. And so there's really broader impacts of that on country. But through reforming and reshaping it, we can increase and have increased and equitable access to nutritious food systems, reduce emissions, increase biodiversity. And you can see all of these arrows, like there's causal pathways and relationships, but essentially what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that empowering Indigenous peoples to continue practicing our culture and coming on that journey with us and shifting paradigms and transforming the way that we see the land and connect to the land is ultimately a great solution. That makes it look sort of easy. It's not, essentially. Oh, this is my third chapter of my thesis is going to focus on this. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to whiz through this relationship. If I had time, I would talk about all of the indicators of this. We can chat about it in the break afterwards. Key takeaways, basically, the climate crisis is a health crisis, but fundamentally it's a human and land rights crisis. We need to be prefacing Indigenous human land rights as solutions to the climate crisis, but in the right way. To do so, we need to shift power and reform, frankly, total systems. Advocate for our rights. You are a powerful platform. That was demonstrated yesterday, particularly in that slide of how people trust doctors and health professionals. You are a powerful platform. Walk with us, sit with us, listen to us, hear our stories, and join us in the fight for our country and our lands and our culture, because you also live here and you are also impacted by this. Work with us. Yep, I just said that. So yeah, my hope is that we can reshape the future that recenters and reshapes our relationship to country in a way that is not extractive and that is empowering and sustainable, because the current mode of operating right now is not. And my people have lived on my lands for 65,000 years. Can we look at ourselves in the mirror and say, we will be here for another 65,000 years in the way that we're going? Darandang, thank you. This is my mum's artwork, if you liked it as well, called Heal Country, Heal Climate. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Amba-Rose, for such a thoughtful and eye-opening discussion. Next is Victor Lopez-Carmen. He is a Dakota and Yaqui writer, an Indigenous climate health advocate who graduates with his MD from Harvard Medical School this spring. Over the past decade, he has advocated for Indigenous youth health and climate action across the United Nations system as the former co-chair of the UN Global Indigenous Youth Caucus and a current associate board member of Health and Harmony, which is an international NGO dedicated to protecting Indigenous rainforest rights. He is also a 2024 Climate and Health Equity Fellow. Welcome, Victor.
Thank you. Haumatakiapi, Victor Machiapi, Hunkpati Dakota, Nayaki Mataha. Hello, everyone. My name is Victor. I'm an enrolled member of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe in South Dakota, and I'm also from the Yaqui tribe in Arizona. I'm really grateful to the organizers for inviting us here and bringing Indigenous young people into this conversation. So I just want to say thank you. I have no disclosures to make. Again, these are my tribal flags here. On the bottom is the Yaqui, and the top is the Crow Creek Sioux, which is also known as the Hunkpati Dakota. These are our traditional lands. On the left are the traditional lands of the Yaqui. We make up a tribe in Arizona, but we have various smaller communities in Tucson, in Phoenix, in California. Our traditional lands are also in Mexico as well, in Sonora. We have 8 pueblos there, and that's what you can see on the left. And on the right, this is the Dakota Territory, basically encompassing most of South Dakota, North Dakota, go into Canada, Minnesota, Wyoming, and also in the northern parts of Colorado too. So in 2019, like Amba said, Indigenous peoples encompass 6.2% of the global population, and 80% of the biological diversity is within the lands that they manage. When I worked for the International Indian Treaty Council, we compiled this survey. It represented 118, we took 118 surveys from 28 countries, from all the 7 UN Indigenous regions, representing 134 Indigenous nations, which encompass 3,648,663 Indigenous peoples. And we compiled this survey to identify different aspects of how Indigenous peoples rely upon the land and use the land. Most of the surveys came from Latin America and North America. You can see here we have representation from Africa, the Pacific, Arctic, Central and Eastern Europe, Asia as well. So one of the questions that we asked is, what is the traditional means of subsistence for your community, your nation, your people? And this is the breakdown from that survey. So you can see across all modes of obtaining food, of obtaining nutrition, Indigenous peoples pretty much use all of them: fishing, hunting. I want to zone in on hunting because I think that in the climate and environmental movement, that has been very controversial. And I would like to encourage everyone to understand that when Indigenous peoples hunt, we've done that sustainably. And we do that in a way where we respect the land, we respect all of creation. And I think more and more these days, we're seeing the environmental and climate movement get on board with Indigenous hunting rights, but this is still an issue across the world. And many Indigenous peoples, including in the United States and Alaska, still rely on hunting, sustenance hunting, for their food. One of the other questions we asked was, has your community, nation experienced one or more climate crises situations that have impacted your traditional food systems and traditional livelihoods? And 94% said yes. One example, we got surveys from Puerto Rico, from the Taino, who still exists, by the way. And Hurricane Maria really impacted their ability to fish. And this is just one example that I wanted to give. Another question we asked is, has your food system, your food related practices been impacted by human rights violations that your community, your tribe, your nation experienced? And the majority said yes. This picture is a picture of my uncle in Rio Yaqui in Sonora. We have an aqueduct, a dam that diverts our fresh water that was guaranteed to us in a treaty from the Mexican government in the 1940s to large-scale growers in nearby large cities in Mexico. And that's an infringement upon our rights. It's a human rights violation because we were guaranteed that water. We've been relying on that water for our sustenance for thousands of years. And now they're taking our water, and our community's health is at extreme risk because we still rely on that water for our sustenance as well. And the alternatives that we've been provided are very unhealthy. So I want to zone in on this cycle of harm. I see this as a cycle of harm between Indigenous rights violations, the expansion of fossil fuel and energy development on our lands, and worsening climate change. And I want to zone in on Indigenous child health. One of the I plan to go into pediatrics or emergency medicine. We'll see. I submitted the match, so, but I do focus on Indigenous youth. A lot of my work has been on that. And I want to zone in at each level, at each phase in the cycle, it weakens Indigenous health, and especially Indigenous child health. I'm going to give an example that zones in on the US of the Oceti-Sakowin. Again, this is our traditional lands, specifically our treaty territory that was defined in the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, ratified by the Senate, signed by the US president. This was the land that was guaranteed to our people as long as the grass grew and the water ran, which, as far as last time I was there, the grass was still growing. But this, in yellow, you can see the land that was originally promised to us when we signed this treaty. So the treaty writes, in the Fort Laramie Treaty, it read, "The United States hereby agrees that the country north of the North Platte River," which I showed there, "and east of the summits of the Bighorn Mountains shall be held and considered to be unceded Indian territory, and also stipulates and agrees that no white person or persons shall be permitted to settle upon or occupy any portion of the same, or without the consent of the Indians first had and obtained to pass through the same." And again, this was signed by the president. This was a nation-to-nation treaty. It'd be equivalent if the US made a treaty, with France or with Germany or any other country in the world. And of course, as you know the story, we started to slowly lose our lands, secondary to Indigenous rights violations. They found a rock, a yellow rock that they really liked, and they started moving in and mining and taking our land. And you can see the land whittled down over years. In 1868, this was our reservation boundary. We lost more land in 1877, more, and these are the current tribal lands, which you see are vastly less than what we were promised by the US government. And so the treaty was broken, just like every other treaty that was made with Indigenous nations in the United States. And like I said, a huge impetus for these violations were economical. We're taking the land so they could use it for profits. Like we see today, huge corporations are often the largest perpetrators of not only Indigenous rights violations, but of advancing climate change and the things that worsen it. One of the examples was the Homestake gold mine that was operated in the Black Hills until 2002. It was the largest and deepest gold mine in North America. And today, these are some of the mines that are being proposed in the Black Hills today. There are multiple sites. These are just a few examples of current mines that are either active or being proposed or pursued within our treaty territory, including the Black Hills. And one example I want to give that Indigenous peoples put our money where our mouth is, like Amber was saying, we take care of the land. The US Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills were illegally stolen from our people. And instead of giving us the land back, they put money in a bank account and tried to pay us off for what they considered the land to be worth at the time. But for us, the land is priceless. We don't put a price on it. We didn't sell or buy. And we don't look at it that way. And so today, we're one of the poorest tribes in the United States, some of the poorest people on planet Earth, actually, even though we're in a global North country. Our lifespan, if you considered our territory its own country and our reservations, we'd have the second lowest lifespan behind Haiti in all of the Western Hemisphere. And in this bank account, the money has accrued over time, and now it sits well over $1 billion. And imagine what our tribes could do with this money. But none of our tribes, none of our elders, none of our leaders have ever touched that money. We refuse to touch it, even though we're very, very poor and we could probably do a lot with it, but we don't care because we value the land well above anything that money could ever buy. So one example of another development on our land, as many of you probably know, the DAPL pipeline. This was the UN Special Rapporteur speaking on the rights to freedom and peaceful assembly when our people were trying to protest that pipeline, which was built within the treaty territory that I showed you. He says, law enforcement officials, private security firms, the North Dakota National Guard have used unjustified force to deal with opponents of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And we talk about intergenerational trauma as if it's something in the past, but military, police are still inflicting this on our young people. There were young people pulled out of sweat lodges when they were protesting. There were elders being shot still, flash grenades going off next to pregnant women. This colonization is happening today. It's not something in the past. And the US is still protecting these developments by inflicting violence upon us and the land. Another example in another part of the world is mining, and I want to focus in on the impact of it on Indigenous girls. There's a mine in Papua New Guinea and in the Porgera community. And secondary to mines, I think a lot of people think of, oh, poisoned waters, which is true, poisoned air, which is true. Those all have health impacts. But what about all the men coming into the community from outside? The non-Indigenous men, the white men who inflict sexual violence on our young girls. What are the health impacts of that? STDs, STIs, yeah, sure, but also intergenerational trauma, increased suicide rates, all the things that come in the life cycle from that sort of violence. There were 11 women and girls who were raped, gang raped, violently molested from these men coming into the community, and they got a settlement from a Canadian mining company that was operating this mine. And their community said that the guards and mobile police that were protecting that mine, again, the protection of the mines is also a part of this, have sexually assaulted, raped more than 200 women and girls over 2 decades. And so you can think of so many health impacts of that sort of activity as well. And then also want to talk about the changing climate. I just wanted to touch on, we talk about climate migration as well. A lot of the climate migrants are Indigenous peoples who can no longer sustain themselves on their land, who are migrating north. And I just wanted to recognize that so that when we talk about people at the border, recognizing that a lot of these people are climate migrants who are Indigenous. Another example, talking about food. So we talk about colonization, for instance, people talk about the health impacts of things like smallpox, and they're like, oh, well, smallpox, some people say smallpox spread itself. Like, how could that have been stopped? But I want to, identify that colonization was not something that happened by accident. This was policy. This was intentional. One example was the extermination of buffalo. It was US policy to order their military to kill and slaughter as many buffalo as humanly possible. In 1800, there were 60 million buffalo here. At one point, by 1900, that went all the way down to 300 buffalo. And this is a quote from US General Phil Sheridan, that let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo are exterminated. It is the only way to bring a lasting peace and allow civilization to advance. So this was very, very intentional. And our people, our health, relied upon the buffalo. It still does. And I'd also want to hone in on the role that buffalo have in preventing, mitigating, and adapting to climate change. Studies have supported that the way buffalo are on the land, I mean, it's pretty obvious they've been here for thousands of years, millions maybe, that buffalo support the biodiversity on the land and prevent soil erosion, unlike cows. They have a lower carbon footprint, much lower than cows. And tribal nations still consider them an envisioned basis for their health, for their cultural sovereignty. for their food base and are actively trying to still revitalize the population of buffalo so that we can continue to rely upon them, especially given their climate resilience. In October 2015, 100,000 cattle died in a blizzard in South Dakota, and no buffalo deaths were reported. The buffalo have been on that land, for thousands of years, and they're very climate resilient. And I think this is something we have to look forward to support, given when it comes to the adaptation conversation, especially. I also want to zone in on type 2 diabetes. So we look at the eradication of indigenous traditional food systems, and studies have supported that our traditional foods protect against type 2 diabetes. Colonization attacked our traditional foods. Not only did they try to eradicate them, they then implemented policy to replace our traditional foods with notably unhealthy foods, sugar, starch, fat. And so this is not inherent to who we are. The rates of obesity, the rates of diabetes is not our culture. That's not who we are. We've always been very healthy. This was, again, US policy intentionally, slowly killing us. And this is why we see increased rates of type 2 diabetes in our communities. And all of this activity has gone hand in hand with climate change activities, with the things we know that perpetuate climate change, the mining, the drilling, the things that produce carbon. And that climate change further decreases our access to traditional foods from things like drought. We need to be able to grow our food. The buffalo need to be able to sustain off the land. How are they going to do that when climate change is worsening these droughts? So this is, again, an example of the vicious cycle. And I want to hone in the leading cause of death for American Indians and Alaska Natives. You can see number 4 for both male and female is diabetes. Causes of death secondary to diabetes. But we know that, that the diabetes, for instance, has a correlation, with things like heart disease as well. And so, again, these statistics, we have to look at the why, because we're not going to be able to do anything about it if we don't know why this is happening. And it all goes back to colonization. And our life expectancy is the lowest in the United States out of any other race as well because of these factors. This is also, I wanted to look at more recent data, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. The New York Times reported Native Americans have some of the highest rates of health conditions, such as obesity and diabetes, that make a person much more likely to die from COVID-19. Not only did we start off at the pandemic with the lowest lifespan, but we lost the most lifespan out of any other race as well. 2021, our lifespan was 65 years, and we had some of the highest rates of COVID-19 deaths as well, especially among the ages 40 to 64. So what can we do about it? I think at every stage, whether you're a climate health organization or a government, you have to know what the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is, because this is known as the minimum standard for our survival, our dignity, and our well-being. A lot of countries have signed on, that they've endorsed it, they've agreed it. Some countries like Bolivia have even ratified it into their constitution. But at every stage, I think Indigenous peoples have advocated and agree that these standards need to be upheld by every country. The United Nations, its bodies, including the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and states shall promote the respect and full application of provisions of this declaration and follow up on the effectiveness of this declaration. And I want to note that the 4 last countries who signed on or who indicated formally that they agreed with this declaration were the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. The former British colonies and current, I would say. And so I think that's very notable, and also some of the biggest emitters and countries most responsible at the moment among them for climate perpetuation of climate change. So again, this is the minimum standards in one of the articles itself. One of the articles, Indigenous peoples have the right to the conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of their lands or territories and resources. Right to health and traditional healing related practices in Article 24. Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines to maintain their health and practices, including conservation of their vital medicine plants, animals, and minerals. Article 30, military activities shall not take place in our lands. Also, the underscoring the importance of representation in governments and consultation, free, prior, and informed consent as well is very important. Before any development can take place in our land, Indigenous peoples have the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And then violence against Indigenous women and children is also covered. States shall take measures in conjunction with Indigenous peoples to ensure that Indigenous women and children enjoy the full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. And this also is inherent in the Paris Agreement, which we know is one of the seminal documents of the UN Climate Convention, and something that is often referred to in climate discussions across the United Nations. The Paris Agreement underscores that the rights of Indigenous peoples are vital in mitigating, adapting, preventing further climate change. And thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Victor and Amba-Rose, for opening our eyes and having such a discussion with us. We do have time for a few questions, so we have mics on the side. If you have a question, please do indicate by joining on the side. You have very clearly shown that the rights of Indigenous peoples have been abused for hundreds of years. How do we move forward to ensure that policymakers are incorporating the beliefs and the perspectives and the needs of Indigenous peoples as we talk about climate change policies?
Big question. No, important question. I think for me, it's not just policymakers, it's across the board, it's across sectors. I think starting with the places of power, where all these sectors stem from, so the government, I think is a great way to start. And it cannot simply be us going to policymakers and saying X, Y, Z. It's about shifting minds, decolonizing our minds, our hearts, and our understandings of history. For me, everything is contextual and stems from what has happened, has influenced the now. And we need to understand that in a way that is truthful and acknowledges exactly how we're here. So truth-telling. I think we need mass truth-telling before we can even think about the idea of reconciliation. In Australia, a few months ago, we had a national referendum about including an Indigenous voice to Parliament, which did not go through. The Australian public voted against that. It was a very constitutionally sound and safe referendum or proposal. There certainly was debates, within Indigenous communities as well about its function. But I think what I'm kind of speaking to is how can we get to a place of healing, of reconciliation, of appropriate action in response to the challenges that we're facing if we do not reconcile? Maybe that's it, I'll use a different word. If we do not talk about and genuinely confront what has happened that has influenced why we're here. So I think for me, it's not just simply saying do X and Y, and that will equal Z. We need rigorous truth-telling and acknowledgement, because I don't think, not to say that monetary value is at all what we value. It's that it's our land, but you could not even put a dollar figure on the amount of reparations that colonies owe Indigenous peoples. So I think starting from how we got to where we are is an important discussion. So yeah, I think it's also a lifelong journey. Like what we're talking about is something that is an everyday experience. It's an everyday fight. And I think people, governments joining us on that fight is an important part of genuine solutions.
Mm-hmm. You both have talked about indigenous knowledge and how this knowledge has been gained over hundreds and thousands of years. how can we incorporate that into scientific knowledge for climate mitigation and adaptation? And I know that's part of what you are doing now, Amba-Rose.
Yeah, did you want to?
Let's do the thing.
So yeah, I think again, it's not simply merging X with Y, create Z. It's looking at how our knowledges are formed. It's not simply a knowledge base that is disconnected from all other aspects of our societies. And so there is a space for Indigenous knowledges and Western knowledges to work alongside one another, but the process, the methodological approach to coming to that conversation needs to be, again, grounded in truth-telling and respect, not simply, we'll do this, you do that, or if, you know, it's so much more than simply just merging of knowledges. There's a whole process to make it appropriate and genuine. But, you know, one of the things my communities tell me is that we want to work with you. We want you to hear our stories and to hear our ways of doing things and figure out how we can work together. Again, back in my earlier years of, you know, more anger, it was, you know, how could this work? But if I put the well-being of my country and my land before everything else, then it opens my heart up to working together and to joining each other in a conversation that is grounded in like true reciprocity with each other and with the land. So there is definitely a space, but it has to be done in the right way, not in an extractive or an exploitative way. Again, our solutions, our knowledges are not a band-aid fix for problems we did not create and are disproportionately impacted by.
Question?
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Amba-Rose. I actually had a question kind of building on what you were just talking about. I think what I struggle with is the situation we're currently in is one of great urgency, right? Where we have to act to protect the climate and we have to act now. And what we're building on is generations of extraction, colonialism, like systemic mistrust between the colonizing powers and Indigenous peoples who've been working this entire time to defend their lands. And so my question is about your vision, each of you, for those of us who are not Indigenous, approaching communities who have been stewards of the land in a way that doesn't feel extractive and that builds trust, with the recognition that trust building is usually a multi-generational thing. And what happens when we're faced with a very urgent crisis and we want to work with communities to create a solution that's timely, but we do not have the trust of the community because of our legacy of violence and extraction. So what would be your vision, or what examples do you have of people who are doing this the right way? Or what advice do you have for us on like how we might be able to approach from a place of reciprocity and building together?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, you know, it starts with education, coming into the conversation, feel like already having done your research, depending on who you're going to, you know, what's the history of that community on that land, you know, what rights violations have they faced, how did they get where they are, what is their traditional territory, what are they fighting for? They've probably put out statements. They probably, at some point, their tribal council, you know, at various points probably went to Congress and are fighting for certain things already. And then you can just, you know, snowball approach it. And then you're coming to the conversation already sort of with a background, so they don't have to explain everything and do as much educating as they would have had to. And then you can, you know, you hit the ground running. That's what I would say.
Well, we certainly could have used more time. Both of you have brought so much to us today in such a short time. And I feel that we need more time to delve further and to see where we can work collaboratively but we are out of time. So I would like to thank both of you for being open, honest, and bringing your culture here to this discussion and this space. And we thank you for being in the audience and being open and receiving to what they have brought. And they will be here, I hope, for a little while to answer some more questions as we have to close our panel. Thank you.
Thank you.